The melody came to her on the wind first, so faint she thought she had imagined it. Wren Calloway stood at the edge of the county road where the asphalt cracked and gave way to gravel, holding a duffel bag that contained everything she owned, and she heard 3 notes drift out of the tree-line like something exhaled by the forest itself. She was 19 years old. She had been turned out of the group home in Hollis Fork the morning of her birthday, the way they all were, with a folder of paperwork and a bus voucher and a handshake from a caseworker who could not quite meet her eyes. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The voucher had taken her as far as this nothing town in the Caraway Hills, and the $72 in her pocket had to take her the rest of her life, and she had no idea where the rest of her life was supposed to begin. The notes came again, higher this time, then falling, a small bright phrase that turned over twice and stopped. She knew that melody. That was the thing that made her stand still on the gravel with her heart going strange in her chest. She knew it the way you know your own name spoken in a crowded room. Not as a memory exactly, because she had no memory before the age of 4 that anyone had ever been able to coax out of her, but as something older than memory, lodged somewhere beneath it. The tune lived in her the way her own pulse did. She had hummed it to herself in the dark of a dozen different bedrooms, in foster placements that lasted a season and placements that lasted a year, in the long, echoing nights at Hollis Fork when the other girls were asleep and she lay listening to the radiator tick. The staff there had asked her once where the song came from, and she had said she didn't know, and that was the truth, and it had bothered her for 15 years that it was the truth. A person should know where their own song came from. Now the song was coming back to her out of a forest in a town she had never set foot in until 90 minutes ago. She told herself there was a rational explanation. A wind chime, maybe, hung on someone's porch deep in the trees. A child's toy left out in a yard. The hills were full of old homesteads, half of them abandoned, and abandoned places held all kinds of small sounds that the living had forgotten. She told herself this, and she did not believe a word of it, because the melody was not the random scatter of a wind chime. It had shape. It had intention. It started at the beginning and went to the end and started again, patient and exact, and no chime in the world played the same 11 notes in the same order over and over. Wren shouldered her bag and stepped off the road into the trees. She would think about this moment later, many times, turning it over the way you turn over the single hinge on which an entire life swung. She had nowhere to be. That was the plain truth of it. There was no appointment she was missing, no person waiting, no door anywhere in the world that would open wider because she knocked on it. A girl with somewhere to be would have kept walking down the county road toward the cluster of buildings she'd glimpsed from the bus, would have found the diner and nursed a coffee and figured out where the shelter was, if the town even had one. But Wren had nowhere to be, and the song was calling. And she had spent 19 years being told that the things she felt most strongly were the things she should trust least. For once she decided not to listen to that voice. For once she followed the other one. The forest closed over her within 20 steps. It was late October, and the canopy had thinned to a rust and gold lattice, and the light came down through it in slow shifting coins that moved across the leaf litter as the wind moved the branches. The ground rose. She had not expected that. From the road the hills had looked gentle, but the land tilted up under her almost at once, and her sneakers, which were not made for this, slid on the wet mat of fallen leaves so that she had to grab at saplings to keep her footing. The duffel bag dragged at her shoulder. She kept her eyes on the slope ahead and her ears on the melody, and she discovered quickly that the two did not agree. The song seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When she stopped to listen it would fade, and when she moved it would swell again, as if the forest were drawing her on by giving her just enough and never quite enough. She crested the first rise and the trees opened a little, and she saw that she had walked into country that no one had touched in a long time. There was an old stone wall running off through the woods, the kind farmers built 200 years ago when they cleared these hills for sheep, and it had collapsed in places into spills of mossy rock. Beyond it the land dropped into a hollow, and from the hollow the song rose up clear and unmistakable, and Wren felt the hair lift on her arms. She was not imagining it. She had thought, climbing, that she might top this hill and find nothing, find silence, find that she had followed an echo into the empty woods like a fool. Instead, the melody was stronger here than it had been at the road. She was getting closer to it. The song had a source, and she was walking toward the source. She climbed over the broken wall and started down into the hollow. The descent was harder than the climb. The leaves were deeper here where the wind had drifted them, and twice she went down hard, once catching herself on her palms in the cold mud and once sliding several feet on her hip before a tree stopped her. She came up filthy and breathing hard, and she laughed, a short surprise sound that startled a pair of crows out of a hickory. Above her, she could not have said why she laughed. Maybe because the situation was so absurd. A homeless girl, evicted from her own childhood that very morning, sliding down a wet hillside in a forest she'd entered on a whim, chasing a song that no one else could hear. If she'd told the caseworker about this, the woman would have written something careful in the folder. And yet, the song was real. Her muddy hands were real. The cold was getting into her, and the light was beginning to slant toward evening, and somewhere ahead of her, close now, something was playing the only piece of music she had ever truly owned. The hollow bottomed out in a stream, narrow and quick and black between stones, and on the far side of it the trees thinned again, and Wren saw the cabin. She stopped with the water at her toes. It was not much to look at, and that was the first thing she felt, a small foolish stab of disappointment, because some part of her had been building something grander out of the song's promise. It was a low structure of dark logs gone gray with age, a single story, with a steep shake roof furred over in moss and a stone chimney at one end that had lost its cap. One window faced her, the glass intact but milky with grime, reflecting the last of the light so that it looked less like a window than like a blind eye. The clearing around it had gone to seed, the grass waist-high and brown, choked with the dead canes of blackberry and the skeletons of last summer's weeds. A porch ran along the front, its boards humped and rotted, and the steps up to it had collapsed into a heap. Nobody had lived here in years. Decades, maybe. The forest had been patiently swallowing the place for a long time, and it had nearly finished. And the song was coming from inside it. That was the thing that held her at the edge of the stream with the cold water seeping into her shoes. The melody, which had drawn her across 2 hills and down into this hidden fold of the woods, was no longer coming from everywhere. It had a location now. It was coming from behind that milky window, from inside those dark walls, 11 notes rising and turning and falling and rising again, and it was not faint anymore. It was clear and close and mechanical in a way she could finally identify, the small plinking sweetness of struck metal teeth, and she knew with sudden certainty what was making it. A music box. Somewhere inside that ruined cabin, a music box was playing, and music boxes do not play themselves. They run down. A wound spring lasts a minute, 2 at the most, and then the song slows and sags and dies. This one had been playing without pause since she'd heard it from the road, which was the better part of an hour ago. Someone had been winding it. Or something was very wrong with the ordinary rules of the world. Wren stood in the gathering dark and felt fear move through her for the first time. Real fear. The cold, practical fear of a girl alone in the woods at dusk with no one knowing where she was. She could turn around. The thought arrived fully formed and reasonable. She could climb back out of the hollow and find the road and walk to the town and forget the song the way she had spent 15 years almost forgetting it. That was the safe thing. That was what a sensible person would do. But Wren had learned something in 19 years of being handed from one set of strangers to another, and what she had learned was this. The safe thing and the right thing were almost never the same thing, and the people who counseled her toward the safe thing had, without exception, been people who would not have to live with the consequences of her choosing it. She was the only one who had to live in her own life, and she could not live the rest of it wondering what had been playing her song in the woods. She crossed the stream on the stones, slipping once and soaking her foot to the ankle, and she waded through the dead grass to the front of the cabin. And because the steps were gone, she set her hands on the lip of the porch and hauled herself up and over, the rotten board groaning under her, but holding. The door stood before her, heavy planks gone silver, an iron latch eaten orange with rust. The song was loud now, just on the other side of it. She put her hand to the latch, and the cold of the iron went straight through her palm and into her wrist, and she pressed the thumb lever down, and it gave with a grinding click, and she pushed the door open into the dark. The smell came first. Not rot, which was what she'd braced for. Not the wet animal reek of a place gone back to the wild. It was dust and cold stone, and underneath that something dry and faintly sweet, like cedar, like the inside of an old chest. The single window let in just enough gray light to show her the shape of the room. It was one large space, the whole footprint of the cabin, and it was not empty. That was the second thing that stopped her breath. She had expected emptiness, the picked clean shell of a place long abandoned, and instead the room was furnished. There was a long table down the center of it with chairs still pushed in. There were shelves on the walls, and the shelves held things, dim shapes she could not yet make out. There was a stone hearth at the far end, cold, with a kettle still hanging from the crane. The whole room had the hell-breath stillness of a place where someone had stepped out for a moment and never come back, and the dust lay over all of it soft and thick and gray as ash. And in that dust, on the floor, leading from the door to the hearth and back, were footprints. Fresh ones. Wren's heart slammed. She nearly bolted. But the footprints, she saw as her eyes adjusted, were small, smaller than her own, and there was only one set, and they did not go anywhere a person could be hiding. They went to the hearth. And they came back, and they went out the door past her, and the going out ones were on top of the coming in ones, which meant whoever had made them had already left. She was alone. She made herself believe she was alone. And the song was still playing, and now she could see where it came from, because there on the long table, in the exact center of it, swept clear of dust in a clean bright circle, while everything around it lay gray and undisturbed, sat a music box. It was small. It would have fit in her two cupped hands. It was made of some dark wood, rosewood maybe, inlaid across the lid with a pattern of pale wood and mother of pearl that the dim light caught and gave back in small gleams, and the lid was open, and inside it the cylinder turned, slow and steady, the steel comb singing against its pins. 11 notes, rising and turning and falling. Her song. The song she had carried out of a childhood she could not remember, played by an object she had never seen, in a cabin she had found by following the sound of it through the woods. And the box was wound. She could see the brass key still half turned in its side. Someone had wound it, recently, within the last few minutes, and walked out the door, and left it singing on the table for her to find. Wren crossed the room. She did not decide to. She was simply moving, drawn the last few feet the way she'd been drawn the last few miles, and she stood over the music box and looked down at it, and the song poured up at her, and her eyes filled and spilled before she understood she was crying. She had not cried that morning. She had stood in the office at Hollis Fork and taken her folder and her voucher, and she had not cried, because she had decided a long time ago that she would not give them that, and she had walked out the front gate dry-eyed into the first day of the rest of her life. And now she stood weeping over a music box in a dead man's cabin, because it was playing the song her mother had sung to her. She knew it was her mother. She did not know how she knew. She had no face to put to the word, no voice, no single image, nothing the caseworkers and the therapists had ever been able to draw up out of the locked years before she was 4. But she knew, standing there, with the same certainty she'd felt when the first 3 notes reached her at the road, that this was her mother's song, that her mother had sung it to her or played it to her in some room she could not remember, and that her mother had been here, in this cabin, or had owned this box, or had some thread of connection to this hidden place that Wren had stumbled into by following a sound on the wind. The song slowed. The cylinder dragged. The 11 notes stretched and sagged, and the spring ran out, and the music box wound down into silence, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Wren had ever heard. She stood in it a long moment. Then she reached out and touched the box, half expecting it to vanish, and it was solid and cool and real under her fingers, and on the underside of the open lid, where the inlay framed a small oval of bare wood, someone had written something in ink gone brown with age. She turned the box toward the window to catch the light and read it. For words, in a small slanting hand. For Wren, my songbird. The breath went out of her. Her name, her own name, written inside this box, in a hand she did not recognize, in ink older than she was. She was not a girl who believed in fate or signs, or any of the soft magic the world used to comfort itself. She had been raised on the hard arithmetic of need and scarcity and people who left. But there was no arithmetic that explained her name inside this box. There was no version of coincidence large enough to hold a homeless orphan following her mother's song through the woods to a cabin where a music box waited, wound and singing, with her name written on the lid in a stranger's hand. Something had arranged this. Someone had arranged this. The footprints in the dust said so. The freshly wounded spring said so. The clean circle in the gray said someone had set this box on this table not long ago and waited, perhaps, or watched, and then walked out the door knowing she would come. Wren turned in a slow circle, the box clutched against her chest now, and she looked at the room with new eyes, with searching eyes, and she began to see what the dust had hidden from her in the first shock of finding it. The shelves were full of books, hundreds of them, their spines gone soft and pale. There were framed photographs on the mantel, faces turned to gray by the dust and the dark. There was a writing desk in the corner she had not noticed, its surface a drift of papers. There was a rug on the floor, the pattern of it furred over, and at the edge of the rug, near the hearth, the floorboards were a different color, lighter, as if something had once stood there and been moved. And there was, she saw now, a second door, in the back wall, low and narrow, almost hidden behind the end of the bookshelf, and it was ajar, and beyond it was a deeper dark. The footprints went to the hearth. She had thought they went to the hearth. But now, looking more carefully, she saw that they passed the hearth, that they went on to that low back door, that the person who had wound her box had gone through it before circling back and leaving by the front. Wren stood very still and listened to the cabin, and the cabin gave her nothing. Only the tick of cooling air and the far-off water in the hollow, and she made the second decision of the evening, the one that would carry her down out of the ordinary world entirely. She went to the back door. It opened onto a stairway. Stone steps, narrow, descending into the hill, because the cabin was built against the slope, and behind it the land rose and someone had cut down into that rise and lined the cut with stone. A cellar. The air that came up out of it was colder than the room and drier. That same cedar and stone smell, but stronger, concentrated. She could see perhaps 4 steps down before the dark took them. She had no light. Her phone was a cheap prepaid thing with a flashlight that worked when it felt like it, and she dug it out of her pocket now with her free hand and thumbed it on, and the white beam jumped and steadied, and she pointed it down the stairs. The steps went down a long way, farther than a cellar had any business going. She counted them as she descended, the box still pressed to her chest, her wet sneakers squeaking faintly on the dry stone, and she lost count somewhere past 20 because the going down required all her attention. The steps shallow and uneven and slick in places with the breath of the earth. The walls were close enough to touch on both sides. The ceiling was just above her head, and the dark ahead of her swallowed her little beam and gave back nothing, no glint, no shape. Only the suggestion that the space was opening out, that the stairway was about to deliver her into something larger. It did. The stairs ended and the walls fell away on either side, and Wren stood at the threshold of a chamber so much bigger than the cabin above it that her mind refused the scale of it for a moment. Her phone light could not reach the far wall. It could not reach the ceiling. She swept the beam slowly across, and it caught edges, surfaces, the gleam of metal and the dull shine of old wood, and her breath fogged in the cold, and she understood, slowly, the way you understand a thing too large to take in all at once, that the chamber was full. It was full of things. Crates, first. Stacks of wooden crates, banded with iron, rising in the dark like the buildings of a small city, and the crates had stenciling on their sides, letters and numbers gone too dim to read from where she stood. Beyond them, when she moved the light, shapes under canvas, large and small, the drop cloths gray with the same dust as the room above. Shelving along one wall, deep steel shelving, and on the shelves the regular gleam of stacked metal, bars of it, neat and orderly, and catching her light back in a low yellow burn that she did not let herself name. Against another wall, paintings. She knew they were paintings because the canvas had slipped off one, and she could see the gilt edge of a heavy frame and the dark varnished surface within it. A face, a woman's face, looking out at her across the cold from some other century. There were cabinets with glass fronts, and behind the glass, when she crept closer with the light shaking now in her hand, there were coins, hundreds of coins, thousands, laid out in velvet trays, gold and silver, ranks and ranks of them. There were long flat cases of the kind that hold documents. There was a rack of what could only be swords, their hilts wrapped, their blades sheathed. There was, in the center of it all, a single chair, an ordinary wooden chair, facing the stairs, as if someone had sat there a long time in the dark among all of it, keeping watch. Wren stood at the foot of the stairs with her dead mother's song still ringing in her ears and her own name pressed against her heart, and she looked at a fortune the size of which she had no way to measure, hidden in the earth beneath a cabin she had found by accident at the end of the worst day of her life. And the only coherent thought that surfaced through the roar in her head was that she should not be here, that this belonged to someone, that things like this did not get left in the ground for homeless girls to find. And underneath that thought, quieter, was another one, and the other one said, "Someone wound the box. Someone wrote your name. Someone left the door open and the steps clean and walked out into the woods knowing you would come. This was left here. This was left here for you." She did not let herself believe it. Believing it was dangerous, and Wren had survived 19 years by being suspicious of every good thing the world appeared to offer, because the good things were always the bait on someone's hook. But she could not entirely disbelieve it either, not with her name in brown ink against the inlay. And so she stood frozen between belief and disbelief in the cold heart of the hill, and that was when she heard, from the top of the stairs, very faint, the front door of the cabin open. Wren killed her light. She did it without thinking, her thumb finding the button by instinct, and the dark dropped over her absolute and total, and she stood in it with her pulse banging in her throat and listened. Footsteps, above her, crossing the room. Slow, unhurried. The deliberate tread of someone who knew the cabin, who was not searching, who was simply walking through it the way you walk through your own home. The steps crossed to the table, she thought, to where the music box had been, and then they stopped, and there was a silence. And in the silence Wren understood that whoever was up there had just discovered that the music box was gone. The footsteps came toward the back door. She had to move. She could not stay at the foot of the stairs where the descending person would walk straight into her. But she did not know the chamber, had seen it only in fragments by a failing light, and to move through it in the dark was to invite a fall, a knocked-over crate, a sound that would give her away utterly. She made herself remember what the beam had shown her. The crates, to her left, stacked in rows with gaps between them. She edged left, one hand out, the box clutched to her chest with the other, and her fingers found the rough banded wood of a crate, and she slipped into the gap behind it, and crouched down small in the black, and held her breath. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A light bloomed up there, warmer than her phone, the swing and sway of a real lantern or a good torch, and it came down the steps, throwing the shadows of the stair walls leaping ahead of it, and Wren pressed herself into the stone and watched a wedge of yellow light slide across the floor of the chamber and find the empty chair in the center and stop there. The person came off the bottom step. Wren could see the legs, the boots, old work boots, and the hem of a long coat, and the light swung up and the person stood looking out over the chamber, over the horde, the way Wren herself had stood looking at it minutes before, and then a voice spoke into the dark, an old voice, dry and cracked and not unkind, and it said, "You can come out, child. I've been waiting for you a very long time." Wren did not move. Every instinct she had hammered at her to stay hidden, to wait, to let the old person search and give up and leave, because people who said they had been waiting for you were exactly the kind of people the world had taught her to run from. But the voice came again, patient, and it said, "You found the song. I knew you would, if you ever came near these hills. I wound the box for you every day for 11 years, on the chance the wind would carry it to the right ears. Today it did. There's no need to be afraid. My name is Vale, and I knew your mother, and everything in this room is yours." The lantern light turned slowly, searching the rows of crates, and Wren, crouched in her gap with the box against her heart and the cold stone at her back, watched the wedge of yellow come sliding toward her hiding place, and she understood that in another few seconds it would find her, and she would have to decide whether to believe a stranger in the dark who knew her name and her song and claimed to have known the mother she could not remember, or whether to run from him into the deeper black of a chamber she could not see, carrying a fortune she did not understand. On the first night of a life she had no idea how to live. She thought of the morning, the folder, the handshake, the gate of Hollis Forks swinging shut behind her. She thought of $72 and a bus voucher already spent. She thought of 19 years of safe choices made by other people on her behalf, every one of which had landed her here, alone, with nothing. The light found her. It stopped on her face and held there, and behind it she could see now the shape of the old man, tall and stooped, white-haired, his face a topography of deep lines, and his eyes in the lantern glow were wet and bright and fixed on her with an expression she had no name for because no one had ever looked at her that way before, as if the simple fact of her existence were a thing to weep over with joy. He did not come toward her. He stood where he was and held the light and let her look at him as long as she needed to. And when at last she rose from behind the crate, slowly, the music box held out a little in front of her like a question. He made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and he said, "There. There she is. You've got her eyes. God help me, you've got Maren's eyes." Maren. The word went through Wren like the first 3 notes had, like the writing on the lid, a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She had never had a name for her mother. The file said mother deceased and gave nothing else, no name, no history, a blank where the most important person in a life should be. And this old man in a cellar full of treasure had just handed her one across the dark as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Maren. Her mother's name was Maren. Wren's mouth opened and no sound came out, and Vale lowered the lantern so it lit them both, the old man and the girl, in the buried chamber, and he said gently, "Come up out of the cold, Wren. I'll make tea, and I'll light the fire, and I'll tell you everything. You've a great deal owed to you, and I've a great deal to answer for, and we've waited long enough, the both of us. Come up." He turned and started back toward the stairs, the lantern lighting his slow way, and he did not look back to see if she followed, and that more than anything decided her, because a person who meant her harm would have watched her, would have hurted her, would have kept her in front of him. Vale simply walked away into the light and trusted her to come, and Wren, who had never in her life been trusted with anything, found that the trust pulled at her harder than any rope. She looked once more at the chamber, the crates and the canvas shapes and the low gold burn of the shelves, all of it sinking back into the dark as the lantern climbed the stairs and took its light away, and then she gathered the music box close and followed the old man up out of the earth. The cabin above was warmer for the lantern in it, or seemed so. Ethan set the light on the long table and went to the hearth and knelt at it with a grunt, and began laying a fire from a basket of split wood Wren had not noticed before, his hands sure at the work, and she stood near the table watching him and saying nothing, because she had 1,000 questions and could not find the first one. He got the kindling going and fed it, and the flame climbed, and the room woke up around them in the orange light, the books and the photographs and the drift of papers on the corner desk all swimming up out of the gray, and Ethan settled back on his heels and watched the fire take, and said, without turning, "Sit. There's a chair behind you that's held heavier than you. It won't drop you." Wren sat. The chair held. The fire snapped and threw heat, and she realized how cold she'd gotten, how the wet had soaked up her jeans, and her foot was numb in its shoe, and she edged the chair toward the warmth, and the old man rose and hung the kettle on the crane over the new fire and lowered himself into the chair across the table from her with the careful economy of the very old, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her. She looked at the fire because she could not yet look at him. The music box sat on the table between them in its clean circle of swept wood, lid open, silent now, her name hidden against the inlay. "You'll be wanting it all at once," Ethan said at last. "Who I am, who she was, what's in the ground beneath us, why it's yours and how it came to be here, and why no one's touched it in 11 years. I'll tell you all of it. But it's a long story and a hard one in places, and you've had a long day, I think." He nodded at the duffel bag she'd dropped by the door, at the mud dried on her hands and her jeans. "A hard one." So I'll tell it slow, and you'll stop me where you need to, and we'll be at the end of it by morning. Is that agreeable? Wren found her voice. It came out rougher than she meant. How do you know my name? Because I gave it to you. Vale folded his old hands on the table. Or I gave it to her, your mother, to give to you. Wren. For the bird. She wanted to call you something that could fly even if it was small, even if the world thought it was nothing much to look at. A wren's the littlest thing in the hedge, and it sings louder than birds 10 times its size, and it goes where it pleases and nobody owns it. That was her hope for you, that you'd be small and free and loud. His mouth worked. I didn't know if you'd kept it. They might have changed it, the people who took you. I half expected you'd come up that road with some other name and never know the song was meant for you. They didn't change it. Her throat ached. Nobody ever told me what it was for. No, said Ethan softly. I don't suppose they would have. They didn't know. Couldn't have known. That was the whole point, child. That was the terrible, careful point of all of it. They made you disappear so thoroughly that not even you would know what you'd been. He looked at her across the firelight, and the wet brightness was in his eyes again, and he said, You were born in this cabin, Wren. On a winter night, in the room you're sitting in, 19 years ago this past January. Your mother and I were the only souls who knew you'd come into the world at all. And 4 years later she was dead, and you were gone, taken away into a system that swallows children and forgets them, and everything she'd built and gathered and meant for you went into the ground under our feet to wait for you. And I stayed up here in these hills and wound the box every single day, 11 years and more, so that if you ever came home, you'd know your own song and follow it. And here you are. His voice broke clean through. Here you are. You came home. The kettle began, very softly, to sing. Ethan rose and lifted the kettle off the crane and poured the water into a battered tin pot with a handful of dark leaves already waiting in it. And the steam came up smelling of mint and something resinous and strange. And he set 2 cracked cups on the table and filled them and pushed one toward Wren. She wrapped her cold hands around it and felt the heat soak into her fingers, and she did not drink. She watched the old man lower himself back into his chair and blow across his own cup and gather himself the way a person gathers himself before lifting a weight they have carried too long. Your mother was not from here, he began. She came to these hills the way you came today, following something, not a song, in her case. She was running, and she ran until the running ran out. And where it ran out was the bottom of that hollow, on the bank of that stream, on a day in early spring when the water was high and cold. I found her there. I was a younger man then, though not young, and I lived alone in this cabin as I'd lived alone for years, and I went down to the stream for water, and there was a woman sitting on the bank with her shoes in her hands and her feet in the snow melt, and a look on her face that I knew, because I'd worn it myself once. The look of someone who's decided the world has no place in it for them, and is working out whether to keep arguing the point. He drank. Wren did not move. I didn't say anything wise to her, Ethan said. There's no wise thing to say to a person in that place. I'd had wise things said to me, and they were no use. I just sat down beside her, an old man and a stranger, and I said the water was too cold for bare feet, and she'd catch her death. And she laughed, the way you laugh coming down that hill. Did you know I heard you? A short surprised sound like she'd forgotten she could. And she said maybe that was the idea. And I said, well, if it was, the stream would do the job slow and painful, and there were kinder ways. But if it wasn't, she'd best come up to the cabin and dry her feet by the fire, because I had a fire, and she plainly didn't, and we could decide the larger question once she had feeling in her toes again. He smiled at the memory, an old man's smile, soft and ruined. She came up. She dried her feet by that hearth where the fire's burning now, and she stayed 11 years. Who was she? Wren said. Where did she come from? What was she running from? All in its order. Ethan set his cup down. She came from a great deal of money, your mother. That's the short of it, and the long of it is the whole story, but you should hold that piece first because it explains the rest. Maren was born to one of those families that the word rich doesn't reach. Old money. The kind that's been money so long it stopped thinking of itself as money and started thinking of itself as a kind of nobility, a bloodline, a thing to be defended. The Ashfords. You won't have heard the name, and that's by design. They kept themselves out of the papers the way the truly powerful do, but in the rooms where such things are counted, they were counted very high. Banks, land, shipping, going back to before the country was a country, and mines, later, and rail, and the kind of holdings that don't have a name you'd recognize because they own the companies that own the companies. Maren was the only child of the only child. Everything the Ashfords had built across 2 centuries was going to come down to her, and that, child, was the trap she was caught in. Because a girl who is the sole heir to a fortune like that is not a person to the people around her. She is an asset. She is a vessel for the continuation of the thing. And your mother had the great misfortune of being a real and stubborn and tender-hearted person trapped inside the body of an asset, and she would not stop being a person no matter how hard they tried to make her into a vessel, and so they decided, the family did, that she was unwell. Wren's hands tightened on the cup. Unwell. It's an old trick and a filthy one, Ethan said, and for the first time there was iron in the dry old voice. When a person with money won't behave as the money requires, you don't argue with them. You don't have to. You declare them mad. You find a doctor, and there's always a doctor who can be found, and you have them written up as unstable, as a danger to themselves, as incapable of managing their own affairs. And then you take the affairs into your own hands, for their own good, you understand, out of love and concern, and the person who is going to inherit everything finds that everything is being managed on their behalf by the very people they were trying to get free of. Maren saw it coming. She was sharp, your mother, sharper than all of them, and she saw the shape of what they meant to do before they'd quite done it. There was a man they wanted her to marry, a cousin of a cousin, to keep the fortune folded in on itself, and she refused him, and that was the refusal that tipped it. They moved to have her committed. And the night before the papers were to be signed, she ran. He was quiet a moment, looking into the fire. She took almost nothing. That was the cleverness of it and the desperation of it both. If she'd taken money, they could have traced the money. If she'd taken the car, they'd have found the car. She walked out the side door of a great house in the dark with the clothes on her back and a little money she'd been hiding away in cash for months, a few $100s, and she got on a bus, and then another bus, and she kept moving and shed everything that could mark her until she was just a woman with cold feet on the bank of a stream in hills nobody important had ever heard of. She'd done it. She'd gotten free. And the cost of getting free was that she had nothing and no one and nowhere, and she'd come within a few cold inches of deciding it hadn't been worth it. He looked back at Wren. That's where I came in. A lonely old man and a runaway heiress, the 2 of us, here in this cabin. And I'll tell you the truth of it because you've a right to it. I was no relation to her, and I was no romance to her either, before you wonder it. I was something rarer. I was the first person in her life who wanted nothing from her at all. I didn't know who she was. For the first year, I didn't know her right name. She was just Maren, who'd turned up half frozen and stayed, who turned out to be brilliant and funny and a hard worker once she had something worth working at, who learned to split wood and grow a garden and mend a roof, who filled this cabin with books and music and argument and life. I'd been alone a long time. She'd been a prisoner a long time, in a velvet cell, but a cell. We were good for each other. We were like a father and a daughter who'd found each other late, after both had given up on family entirely. Wren finally drank. The tea was bitter and sweet at once, and it steadied her. And the money, she said. All of it down there. If she ran with nothing, Ethan held up one gnarled finger. Now you're asking the right question. She ran with nothing. But the fortune was hers. That was the thing they could never quite get around. The family, for all their doctors and their papers. The bulk of the Ashford holdings were held in a trust, and the trust named Maren as the beneficiary. And there were provisions in it. Old provisions written by her grandfather who'd been fond of her, that the family couldn't easily break. They could manage the money while she was declared unfit. They could not take it from her. And there was a clock running, child, a clock written into the trust by that same fond grandfather, who I think suspected what the rest of them were. The clock said that when Maren reached a certain age, a great portion of the trust would pass to her outright, free of the family's management, hers to do with as she pleased, and there was nothing they could do to stop it but keep her declared mad past that age. And they couldn't do that if they couldn't find her. The committal needed her in hand. A person can't be locked away in absentia forever. There are limits even the rich must bow to, papers that must be renewed, a body that must be produced. As long as Maren stayed lost, the clock kept ticking, and the day came, for years after she ran, when the clock struck and the fortune fell to her, and there was not a thing the Ashfords could do but watch it go. She got it. Wren's voice was barely a whisper. All of it. Here. In the cabin. She got the right to it. Ethan corrected. Which is a different thing, and harder. She couldn't just walk into a bank as Maren Ashford and claim it. The moment she surfaced under her own name, they'd have descended on her, fresh. Doctors, fresh papers, and worse, by then, because by then there was you. You were 2 years old when the clock struck. And a runaway heiress is one thing. But a runaway heiress with a child, an undocumented child, born in a cabin with no record anywhere that you existed, that was a vulnerability they'd have driven a blade straight into. They'd have taken you to control her. She knew it. So she did the thing that took my breath when she explained it to me, the patient, ferocious, clever thing. She claimed the fortune through lawyers, quietly, never showing her face, using the provisions of the trust, and a young attorney she'd found who hated the Ashfords for reasons of his own. And as fast as it came to her, she converted it. She turned the holdings into things. Hard things. Things that hold value and don't sit in a bank with her name on a ledger for the family to watch. Gold. Coins. Art. The kind that's quietly worth fortunes and quietly changes hands. Stones. Old documents and bonds and instruments I don't half understand. She turned a paper fortune into a physical one, piece by piece over 2 years, and she brought it here, to the one place in all the world nobody would think to look, the cabin of a poor old hermit in hills with no name, and she put it in the ground beneath us. She and I dug that chamber out wider than it was and shored it and lined it, and we carried it all down those stairs ourselves, the two of us, in the dark, over months. $395 million, near enough as the lawyer reckoned it, buried under a hermit's cabin, and not one soul on earth knew but her and me. The fire popped. Wren sat very still. The number meant nothing to her. It was too large, a number for governments, not for a girl who'd been counting her life in $72 that morning. What landed instead was the shape of it, the patience of it, a hunted woman building a fortune into the earth piece by careful piece for the sake of a child too young to remember any of it. For me, Wren said. You said it's mine. You said in the cellar everything was mine. It was always meant to be yours. Ethan leaned forward into the firelight. That was the whole purpose. Maren didn't want the money for herself. She'd have been happy in this cabin with her books and her garden to the end of her days. I truly believe that. She wanted it for you. She wanted you to grow up free in a way she never had, with the means to choose your own life and never be anybody's asset, never be trapped, never have to sit on a cold stream bank deciding whether to keep arguing with the world. She used to hold you in front of that fire and tell you about it, when you were too small to understand a word. She'd say, it's all for you, songbird, every bit of it, and you'll never have to marry anyone you don't love or live anywhere you don't choose or be afraid of anyone, ever, because it's all going to be yours. She made the box that winter, had it made by a man she trusted, with your song in it, the song she sang you every night. For Wren, my songbird, in her own hand on the lid, so that whatever happened, you'd have your song. Whatever happened, Wren echoed, and she felt the cold come into the warm room, because she had heard the future tense buried in everything the old man said, the it was meant, the she wanted, the dead weight under all of it. What happened? You said she died when I was 4. How? How did she die? If they never found her, if she'd gotten free, if she had all of this. Ethan Vale closed his eyes. The lines of his face seemed to deepen, and when he opened his eyes again the brightness in them had gone to grief, old grief, grief worn smooth by 11 years of handling, but no lighter for it. That, he said, is the part I've answered for every day since, and will answer for to whatever waits on the other side of my own dying, which won't be long now. They found her, Wren. In the end, they found her. Not the family directly. A man they'd hired. A man whose whole trade was finding people who didn't want to be found. And he was good at his trade. And he'd been hunting Maren for years, patient as I was patient, and one day, he came down into that hollow the way you came down it tonight. And I wasn't here. That was the cruelty of it, the small, ordinary cruelty that the worst things turn on. I'd gone to town. 3 hours, no more. I'd left her and you here safe as I thought, as we'd been safe for 11 years. And I came back up the hollow in the evening, and the front door stood open the way I'd never once seen it stand open, and the fire was dead, and the cabin was empty, and your mother, he stopped. He could not say it. Across the table, the girl who had her mother's eyes sat with her cold tea going colder in her hands and waited, because she had learned long ago that you cannot hurry a person to the bottom of a grief. You can only sit with them at the edge of it until they are ready to go down. And after a long while, Vale wiped his face with the flat of his old hand and found the rest of the words and laid them down between them as gently as he could. Your mother was dead at the foot of the cellar stairs, he said, and you were gone. And the chamber door stood open, and the box was on the table, still playing, because she'd wound it. She'd wound it that very evening to sing you to sleep, and it was the only sound in the whole dead cabin when I walked in. Just the song, just your song, playing to an empty room. Wren did not speak for a long time. The fire burned down, and Ethan rose without a word and fed it, and the new wood caught and threw their two shadows long against the books. And still she said nothing, because there was nothing in her that knew how to hold what he'd given her. She had spent 19 years with a blank where her mother should be, and in the space of one evening the blank had been filled, and then the filling had been taken away again, all in the same breath. She had a mother now, Maren, a woman who'd run from a velvet cell and split her own firewood and held a baby in front of this very hearth and promised her the world. And the mother she'd been given was already dead, had been dead almost the whole of Wren's life, and the having and the losing had arrived together so fast that she could not feel either one cleanly. She felt only a kind of roaring, far back behind her eyes. "Tell me the rest," she said at last. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "You said I was gone. You came back, and she was dead, and I was gone. Where did I go? How did I end up in Hollis Fork? How does a child just disappear out of a cabin in the woods?" Ethan settled back into his chair. "I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you what I worked out after. And I'll be honest where the line is between them, because you've had enough of people telling you stories and calling them facts." He laced his fingers. "When I found her, I did the only thing my old head could think to do. I ran for the town. There's no telephone up here, never has been. I ran the whole way down the hollow and along the road, an old man running, and I got to the town, and I told them a woman was dead in a cabin in the hills, and a child was missing, and they came. The sheriff then was a man named Doss, and a county doctor, and they came up, and they looked at her, and they looked at the cabin." He paused. "And here is the first thing you need to understand about money like the Ashfords had. It doesn't always come at you with a knife. Sometimes it comes at you with a phone call." By the time Sheriff Doss had been up to that cabin and back down, the story had already been arranged. The story was that a transient woman, mentally unwell, with no fixed address, had been living rough in an abandoned cabin in the hills, and had fallen down the cellar stairs in the dark and broken her neck, and her child had been taken into protective custody. Tragic, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happens to people who fall through the cracks. Nobody important had died. Nobody important was even mildly inconvenienced. But that's not what happened. No, the iron was back. That is not what happened, and I knew it wasn't, and I tried to say so. I told Doss there'd been a man, that the door had stood open, that Maren knew those stairs in pitch dark and had gone up and down them 1,000 times, and did not fall down them on a quiet evening with a wound spring still singing on the table. I told him the woman had a name, and the name was worth something, and somebody ought to be looking very hard at who'd wanted her found. And Doss looked at me, child, with a kind of pity, and he said, "Ethan, you're an old man who's lived alone too long, and you've had a shock, and the best thing you can do is go home and not make trouble for yourself with stories." And I understood, the way you understand the weather changing. The thing had already been decided above his head, and he was not a brave man, and the simplest path for everyone was the one where Maren was a nameless madwoman who'd fallen down some stairs, and the simplest path was the one they were all going to walk. "And me," Wren said. "They took me. Protective custody. And then what?" and then you vanished into the system, exactly as the family wanted, which I did not understand at the time, but understood later. Ethan's jaw worked. You were a child of perhaps 4 with no birth certificate, no records, no name anyone could verify, found beside a dead, unidentified woman in a cabin in the woods. Do you know what that makes you? To the machinery of the state? It makes you a ghost. They gave you a name from a list and a birthday they guessed at, and they put you into care, and a ghost with a guessed at name and no history is the easiest child in the world to lose track of, to move, to file, and forget. That was the genius of what the family did, or what their man did. They didn't have to hurt you. They didn't have to do anything so crude as that. They only had to make sure you went into the system stripped of everything that connected you to Maren Ashford, and then the system would do the rest of the disappearing for them, free of charge, with the full weight of its own indifference. A child who can be proven to be the heir's heir is a threat. A nameless ward of the county shuffled between placements is nothing, is no one, is safe to ignore. Wren thought of the folder. The guest at birthday they'd handed her that morning, the one she'd never had any reason to doubt. The blank where a mother's name should be. She had always thought the blanks in her file were the ordinary blanks of a kid nobody had kept good records on. She had never once imagined the blanks were deliberate, were a wall someone had built around her on purpose, brick by brick, to keep her from ever knowing who she was. You let them take me, she said. It was not quite an accusation. She did not have the energy for an accusation. But it was the question under all the questions, and she had to ask it. You knew. You knew who I was and who she was, and what was buried under your floor, and you let them take me into custody, and you didn't say. Why? Why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you tell the truth and take me yourself? The old man did not flinch from it. He had clearly expected it, had perhaps rehearsed it across 11 years of winding the box for a girl who might one day sit in this chair and ask him exactly this. Because I was afraid, he said simply. And because I was right to be afraid, though it shames me to say the two things together as if the second excuses the first. Listen to me, Wren, and decide for yourself whether you can. Forgive it, because I have never been able to. If I had stood up in that town and said, this child is Wren Ashford, heir to a great fortune, and her mother was murdered to get at her, what would have happened? Think it through the way I had to think it through, alone, in the days after, half mad with grief. One of two things. Either no one would have believed me, an old hermit with a wild tale and not a scrap of proof but a music box and a buried hoard I dared not reveal, and they'd have committed me alongside the memory of your mother, and you'd have gone into the system anyway, only now with a target painted on you, a loose old man insisting you were the Ashford heir. Or, worse, far worse, someone would have believed me. The wrong someone. The family, or their man, who was surely still close by, watching to see if anyone made trouble. And then you would not have been a forgotten ward of the county. You would have been a confirmed threat, a child the Ashfords now knew existed and knew the value of. And children who are confirmed threats to fortunes like that one do not grow up, Wren. They have accidents. They fall downstairs. The fire snapped into the silence. So I did the coward's arithmetic, Ethan said. And the coward's arithmetic gave the same answer as the loving one, which is the only mercy in the whole black memory of it. I stayed quiet. I let you become a ghost, because a ghost was alive, and a known heir was a corpse waiting to happen. I let them write your mother off as a madwoman who fell, because the truth would have killed you. And I told myself, the only thing that let me sleep at all those first years, I told myself that the family had what they wanted now. You erased, the threat gone, the fortune theirs in their own minds, even if they could never find where it had got to, and that with the threat erased they would stop hunting. And in that I was right. They did stop. The man left these hills and never came back. They believed they'd won. They believed the fortune was lost forever in some hole only a dead woman knew. And they went back to their great houses and their banks. And the years went by. And you grew up in placements I could never trace because the records were sealed and scattered on purpose. And I stayed here, an old man getting older, guarding $395 million in the ground, and winding a music box every single day, so that if the Wren ever flew home to this hollow, she'd know her own song. He reached across the table, slowly, telegraphing the movement, so she could pull back if she chose, and he touched 2 fingers to the lid of the box where her name was written on the underside. Hidden, and he said, I couldn't come for you. I tried. In the early years, I did try. I wrote letters to the county. I asked after a girl child taken from the hills, and every letter came back with nothing, or worse, with a polite note that no such inquiries could be answered to a person of no relation. I had no standing. I was nobody to you in the eyes of the law, an old man with no claim. And every inquiry I made was a thread that could be pulled, a way for the wrong people to notice that someone still cared what had become of the cabin child. So I stopped. God forgive me. I stopped looking, because looking was the most dangerous thing I could do to you. And I waited. Waiting was all that was left. Waiting and the song. I am ashamed of the waiting, and I would do it again. And those 2 truths have lived side by side in me for 11 years, and they will go into the ground with me, which, as I say, won't be long. Wren looked at his hand on the box, the swollen knuckles, the brown spots, the tremor in it that he could not quite still. She had come into this cabin a few hours ago braced to be deceived, because everyone who had ever offered her something had wanted something back, and the wanting was always the catch. She kept waiting for Vale's catch to show itself, and it did not come. The old man wanted nothing from her. He had spent the last 11 years of his life, the last good years he would ever have, sitting alone in a cold cabin in the woods guarding a fortune that was not his and would never be his, winding a toy for a child he had no way to find and no proof would ever come, on the bare chance that the wind might one day carry the right notes to the right ears. There was no version of that which served him. It served only her, a girl he had known for 4 years a decade and a half ago, a girl he could easily have forgotten, a girl whose fortune he could simply have taken, any day, any year, and walked away rich. He had not. He had stayed and wound the box. You could have taken it, she heard herself say. Any time. All of it. Nobody knew it was here. Nobody knew I was alive. You could have dug it up and disappeared, and lived like a king for the rest of your life, and not one person in the world would ever have known or cared. Why didn't you? Ethan looked at her with something close to surprise, as if the thought had genuinely never lodged in him long enough to need refusing. Because it wasn't mine, he said. It was hers, and then it was yours. A man doesn't take what belongs to a child, Wren. Not even a child he can't find. Not even a child the whole world's agreed to forget. He withdrew his hand. Your mother trusted me with the 2 most precious things she had in the world, with you and with the means of your freedom, and one of them was taken from me by my own bad luck and 3 hours in town. I was not going to fail her with the other. The money waited because you weren't here to claim it, and the day you walked in that door it became yours, and not 1 second before. And I am old, child, and I have made my peace with most things, but I had not made my peace with dying before you came, and now you've come, and I find I can. His eyes filled again. So, that's the rest of it. That's everything I know and everything I worked out. Your mother was Maren Ashford. She loved you past all reason. She was killed for a fortune she'd already hidden where they could never reach it. And that fortune is yours. And so is the truth. And so, for whatever an old man's regard is worth, are you. Now, you've been kind to let me talk this long. Is there anything you want to ask before you sleep? Because you must sleep. You're swaying in that chair. She had not noticed it. The day had been 19 hours long, and it had contained the end of her childhood, and the discovery of her mother, and a fortune in the ground, and a murder 11 years cold, and her body had reached the limit of what it could carry conscious. There were 100 questions left, but only one rose clear of the fog, and it was not about the money, and it was not about the family, and it surprised her with its smallness. The song, she said. Will you teach it to me? The whole of it. I only ever knew it from the inside, from remembering. I want to know it the way she played it. Vale made the sound again, the half-laugh, half-sob, and he reached out and wound the brass key, and the box began to sing, and the old man closed his eyes and sang along with it in a cracked thread of a voice. Words Wren had never heard, but somehow already knew. A lullaby about a small brown bird who was not afraid of the dark because the dark was where the stars lived. And Wren put her head down on her arms on the table and listened to her mother's song in her mother's friend's broken voice, and somewhere in the middle of it she fell asleep, the deepest sleep she had slept in years, And Ethan took off his long coat and laid it over her shoulders and let the fire burn low and sat across from her in the dark, watching the daughter of Maren Ashford breathe, an old man at the end of a long vigil, finally able to rest. She woke to gray light and the smell of frying. For a disoriented moment she did not know where she was, and then it all came back at once, the road and the woods and the chamber and the long telling. And she sat up sharp under the heavy coat, and found Ethan at the hearth with a pan and 2 eggs in it. Eggs that meant he kept hens somewhere out in the ruined clearing, and he glanced over his shoulder and said, "There she is. You slept the clock around, and then some. It's morning. There's water in the basin if you want to wash, and these are nearly done, and after we've eaten there's a great deal we need to decide, you and I, because you can't stay a ghost, and the world out there is going to want explaining to." Over the eggs, which she ate ravenously, the first hot food she'd had in 2 days, they began the harder conversation. Not the past now, but the future, which was in its way more frightening, because the past at least had already happened and could not hurt her worse. The future was all open and full of teeth. "I've thought about this for 11 years, Ethan said. "So let me lay it out, and you tell me where I've gone wrong. Because I'm an old man who's lived in the woods, and the world's surely changed in ways I don't know. The fortune is yours. But you can't simply walk into a bank and say so any more than your mother could. You're a ghost, legally. You've a name that isn't your true name and a history that's a fiction and not a scrap of paper anywhere that ties you to Maren or to the Ashfords. And the moment you do tie yourself to them, the moment you surface and say, 'I am Wren, daughter of Maren Ashford. Here is a fortune she left me,' you become exactly the thing your mother died keeping you from being. A known heir. A threat. The family may believe the money's lost forever, but the family is not gone. There are Ashfords still, cousins, the men who managed the trust, the men who arranged a phone call to a sheriff once and could arrange worse. And they will not be glad to learn that the lost fortune has surfaced in the hands of a girl who is living proof of what they did. Do you follow me? They'd come for me." Wren set down her fork. "Like they came for her. They'd try one of 2 things, the way they always do," Ethan said. "First they'd try to take it. They'd claim the fortune was never lawfully yours, that the trust was tainted, that a mad runaway couldn't lawfully alienate Ashford assets, some tangle of lawyers' words to tie you up in courts for 20 years until you'd spent everything fighting and they'd ground you down. That's the clean way. And if the clean way didn't work, or didn't work fast enough, there's the way they took with your mother. A girl with no family and no history who's just come into a great deal of money is the easiest person in the world to have an accident, Wren. No one would question it. The cabin girl, the lottery of a buried fortune, and then a fall, an overdose, a car off a road. People would shake their heads and say money ruins them, and the Ashfords would quietly settle the estate of the unfortunate young woman, and the fortune would come home to the family at last, and your mother would have died for nothing." He pushed his own plate away, appetite gone. "So we cannot do the simple thing. We cannot surface you as the Ashford heir. Not yet. Not until you are so well protected, so publicly known, so surrounded by people who would notice your falling, that an accident becomes impossible to arrange. The thing that killed your mother was that she could disappear without anyone of consequence noticing. The thing that will keep you alive is making sure you can't. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." How, Wren said. "How do I do any of that? I'm nobody. I have $72 in a duffel bag, and I just turned 19 this morning, yesterday, whenever it was. I don't know lawyers. I don't know how any of this works. I've never had a bank account. I don't even have a real name." The enormity of it crested over her, and she felt, for the first time since the road, close to tears of plain helplessness. "You're telling me I'm worth almost $400 million, and that the people who killed my mother will kill me too if they find out, and that I can't tell anyone who I am, and I don't have a way to buy lunch. How is any of this supposed to work, Ethan? What am I supposed to do?" The old man reached behind him to the cluttered corner desk, the one drowning in papers, and he drew out from a drawer a thick envelope, soft and worn at the corners from years of handling, and he set it on the table between them. "Your mother thought of all of it," he said. She was cleverer than the both of us put together, and she knew she might not live to see you grown, and she did not leave you only the money. She left you a way to claim it. It's in here. Names, instructions, a letter to you in her own hand that I have never opened and never will. That's yours alone. And the most important thing of all, the name of the one person left in the world I believe you can trust, the man who helped her hide all of this in the first place. The young attorney who hated the Ashfords. He won't be young now. He'd be near 60. But Maren trusted him with her life, which is to say with yours, and his name and how to find him are in this envelope. And if he's still living, he is your way through. He knows the trust. He knows what was done to your mother. He knows how to bring a fortune into the light slowly and carefully, and with so much law and so much witness around it, that no one can make it vanish or make you vanish. He is the bridge from the ghost you are to the woman you're meant to be. He pushed the envelope an inch closer to her. I think you should open the letter first. Alone. Before anything. There are things in it that are between you and her and no business of mine. And then, when you're ready, we'll find the lawyer and we'll begin. Wren looked at the envelope. It was the most frightening object she had ever seen. More frightening than the chamber full of gold. Because the chamber was only money and this was her mother's handwriting waiting inside soft paper. Words written by a woman who had known she might die and had sat down anyway to say something to the 4-year-old who wouldn't be able to read it for 15 years. Wren had spent her whole life wanting exactly this, a word from the people who'd made her, an explanation, and I love you with a name attached to it. And she had taught herself not to want it, because wanting it had only ever brought hurt. And now it lay in front of her on a scarred table in a dead woman's cabin, and she found she could not pick it up. Not yet, she said. I can't. Not yet. That's all right. Ethan's voice was very gentle. It's waited 15 years. It'll wait until you're ready. There's no clock on this one. The only clock, and here his tone shifted, became careful, became the voice of a man approaching the thing he'd most needed to say. The only clock, child, is on me. And I have to be honest with you about it, because you'll make different choices if you know, and you've a right to make them with open eyes. He folded his hands. I'm dying, Wren. I want to say it plain so it doesn't ambush you later. There's something growing in me that the doctor in town named once, and I didn't bother to remember, because the naming didn't change it. I've had it more than a year. I'm well past the part where anything's to be done. Some days are fair, and some days I can barely get to the henhouse and back, and they're getting to be more of the second kind than the first. I tell you this not for pity. I've had a long life and most of it lonely, and the last day of it's been the best by a wide road. But because you need to understand that the man who spent 11 years guarding all this has perhaps a few months left to do it, maybe less, and that means the waiting's over whether we like it or not. The clock that mattered before was the family forgetting. The clock that matters now is me. We don't have years to do this slow and safe the way I'd have liked. We have what I have. So when you decide you're ready to begin, ready or not, we'd best begin soon. The gray morning light lay across the table between them, across the music box and the worn envelope and the old man's folded hands, and Wren understood that the universe, having taken her mother before she could remember her, was now offering her the only family she had left on a timer it had no intention of pausing. She had found Eth in Vale yesterday. She might lose him within the season, and she had not even begun to know him. Then we begin today, she said. They did not begin today. The day, as it turned out, had other plans, because that afternoon, as Ethan was showing Wren the workings of the cabin, the henhouse he'd hidden in the lee of the hill, the spring he drew water from, the way he came and went so as to leave no track that anyone watching from the road could follow, Wren happened to be standing at the milky window when she saw, far off across the hollow at the top of the rise where the broken stone wall ran, a figure, just for a moment, a man, she thought, standing at the wall the way she'd stood at it yesterday, looking down into the hollow at the cabin. And then he was gone, stepped back into the trees, and she could not be sure she'd seen him at all, except that the back of her neck had gone cold the way it had in the chamber when the front door opened above her. She said. There's someone on the ridge. The old man came to the window faster than she'd thought he could move, and he looked where she pointed, and the rise was empty now. Only the wall and the trees and the cold autumn light. and he looked a long time before he spoke. "It may be nothing," he said, but his voice had changed, gone quiet and watchful. "Hunters come through these hills in the fall. Folk cut firewood. It may be nothing." But he did not believe it was nothing. She could hear that he did not. "Did you tell anyone you were coming here? Before? The people at the home, the bus, anyone? Did anyone know you were headed for these hills? Or did you tell anyone yesterday what you'd found?" "No one. There's no one to tell. I got off the bus and I followed the song, and there's not a soul on earth who knows where I am." And as she said it, she heard how it echoed what he'd told her last night about her mother. The runaway who could disappear because no one of consequence would notice, and a worse thought arrived on the heels of it. And the bus driver, the man at the station in town who sold the ticket through. They'd remember a girl. If anyone were ever asking, all these years, watching for any sign, a girl getting off a bus alone with a duffel bag in a town that doesn't get strangers, stop. He said it not harshly, but with a flat finality, the voice of a man doing arithmetic at speed. "You're spinning. Maybe rightly, maybe not. The family stopped watching years ago. I'd have staked my life on it. They think the trail's dead cold. But—" He turned from the window. "But it was your mother's mistake to assume she couldn't be found, and I'll not make her mistake on her daughter's behalf. We assume we were seen. We assume it means trouble until it proves it doesn't. That's not fear, that's sense." He moved to the desk, suddenly purposeful, the frailty dropping off him like the coat he'd shed. "It changes the order of things, that's all. We can't wait for you to be ready for the letter. We can't wait for anything. If there's even a chance someone's marked this hollow, then the most dangerous thing in the world is for you to be here, an unknown girl with no protection, sitting on top of $400 million in a cabin 3 hours from any help. We have to get you out, and we have to get you to the lawyer, and we have to start making you into someone who can't be quietly disappeared, and we have to start now, today, this hour." He pulled the worn envelope from where she'd left it and put it firmly into her hands. "You'll read your mother's letter on the road, or you won't read it yet at all, but either way you're leaving this hollow before dark, and I'm coming with you as far as my legs will carry me, and we are going to go and find the one man your mother trusted and put this whole terrible weight into the open where it can't be murdered in the dark. Get your bag." Wren got her bag. Her hands were shaking, and she made them stop. She had spent the morning learning she was an heiress and the afternoon learning she might already be hunted, and the speed of it would have broken a person who hadn't spent 19 years learning to move fast when the ground shifted. But Wren had spent exactly that, and some hard-won part of her steadied and went cold and clear. She shouldered the duffel. She slipped the envelope inside her jacket against her chest. And then she crossed to the table and picked up the music box, because whatever happened next, she was not leaving her mother's song in an empty cabin again, and Ethan saw her do it and nodded once, approving, and said, "Good. That's hers, that's yours, that goes where you go. Now, there's a way out of this hollow that doesn't touch the road, an old logging cut my grandfather used. It comes out 2 miles east at a different road entirely, and there's a man down that road, Halloran, runs a garage, and owes me a kindness from 40 years back and asks no questions. He'll drive us to the city if I ask it. We go out the back. We go now. And Wren." He stopped at the low door with his hand on the latch and looked back at her, the girl with her mother's eyes and her mother's song clutched to her chest, and there was something fierce and glad burning under the grief in his old face. "Whatever's coming, you're not alone in it. Not anymore. Do you understand me? 11 years I waited to be able to say that to you and mean it. You are not alone." It undid her, that, more than the chamber or the letter or the news of his dying. She had been alone so completely and for so long that the word had stopped having an opposite. And here was a dying old man in the woods telling her the opposite was true, telling her she was not alone, and meaning it with the whole of what was left of him. She could not answer. She only nodded, and he saw the nod was enough. And he opened the low door not onto the cellar stairs this time, but onto a second passage she hadn't noticed, a short dark tunnel sloping up and out, and gray daylight showed at the end of it. And they went together up out of the hill and into the trees on the blind side of the ridge, the old man and the girl, leaving the cabin and the buried fortune behind them in the deepening afternoon. They did not see the figure again as they went. The logging cut was overgrown but passable, a green tunnel through the close-grown second growth, and Ethan moved along it slowly but surely, leaning on a stick he'd taken from beside the door, pausing often to breathe, and Wren walked beside him with her hand at his elbow at the steep parts, though he protested he didn't need it. They spoke little. The 2 miles took the better part of 2 hours at his pace, and the light was failing by the time the cut spilled them out onto a different road, narrow and cracked, and there at a bend stood a low cinder-block garage with one light burning and an old man's silhouette moving inside it. Halloran. Ethan leaned on the doorframe and called a name, and the silhouette turned, and there was a moment of disbelief and then of rough delight, and a stooped, oil-stained man of nearly Ethan's age came out wiping his hands and said, "Ethan Vale. I'd heard you were dead. I'd half hoped it. You owe me $40. And then he saw Wren, and saw the look on Ethan's face, and the joking dropped away, and he said only, "Where are we going, and how fast, and who's asking after you?" And Wren understood that this was a man who had lived a long life in these hills and knew exactly the weight of the questions to ask and the ones to leave alone. "The city," Ethan said. "Tonight if you'll do it. And no one's asking after us that I know of. But a man stood on my ridge today who had no business there, and I'd as soon be 3 counties gone before I find out his business. The girl's in trouble, Halloran. The kind you don't ask about. The kind your $40 buys you the privilege of not asking about." Halloran looked at the girl a moment longer. He looked at the duffel bag and the small dark box she held against her like a child holds a toy in a strange place, and whatever he saw in her face decided him, because he'd seen frightened young people before, and he'd seen the difference between the ones running toward trouble and the ones running away from it. "Get in the truck," he said. "Both of you. There's a blanket behind the seat. Girl, you look half froze. I'll tell my sister to mind the place." He spat to the side, businesslike. 3 counties. The city. I can do better than 3 counties. And I can put you on the doorstep of wherever you're going by sunup if you'll tell me the address. And I'll not remember it after. That's a thing my memory does. It lets go of addresses real easy when there's reason. He almost smiled. 40 years, and you turn up with a runaway and a box and a man on your ridge. I knew you weren't as dull as you let on. Come on, then. Daylight's wasting, and it sounds like daylight's not your friend. They climbed into the truck, Wren in the middle with the box in her lap and the envelope against her heart, Ethan at the window with his stick between his knees, and Halloran swung the old vehicle out onto the cracked road and pointed it away from the hills toward the distant glow of the city that lay beyond them. And as the dark came down and the headlights bored their narrow tunnel through it, Wren took the worn envelope out of her jacket at last and held it in her 2 hands and turned it over, and there on the front, in the small slanting hand she'd read on the lid of the box, in ink faded soft with the years, was written, "For my Wren, to be opened when she is grown and has come home." And under that, smaller, as if added later, in a hand that shook a little, "My songbird. Be brave. I knew you would be." Wren slid her thumb under the flap. The old glue gave without resistance. And in the swaying cab of a stranger's truck, by the green light of the dashboard, with a dying man asleep against the window beside her and her mother's song silent in her lap, the daughter of Maren Ashford unfolded the letter her murdered mother had written her 15 years before and began, finally, to read. The letter was not long. That was the first thing that struck her, and it hurt in a way she hadn't anticipated, because she had wanted it to be endless, had wanted pages and pages, a whole mother poured out on a paper to make up for the whole mother she'd never had. Instead, there was a single sheet, written close on both sides, and Wren understood as she read it that her mother had written it in a hurry and in fear, that this was not the leisurely letter of a woman who expected to be there to explain it in person, but the urgent letter of a woman who had looked at her own danger clear-eyed and sat down to leave behind the most that could be left in the least amount of time. Every word had been chosen to do work. "My darling Wren," it began, "if you are reading this, then the thing I have been afraid of has happened, and I am not with you, and you have grown up without me, and that is a grief I cannot let myself feel right now, or I will not be able to finish writing this, and I must finish. So I will be practical, And you will forgive your mother for being practical in the one letter she will ever write you, because being practical now is the last way I have left to love you. First, the things that matter more than money, because you will be told the money matters most, and it does not. You were wanted. Understand that before anything else. You were not an accident or a burden or a complication. I chose you in the worst circumstances a person can choose: a child, alone and hunted and with nothing. And I have never once regretted it. And the 4 years I have had with you so far as I write this have been the only truly free years of my life, freer than all the years of wealth before you, because you taught me what the wealth was for. You were wanted, Wren. You were loved before you were born, and you are loved as I write this, and you will be loved by me after I am gone in whatever way the gone are able to love, and no one can take that from you no matter what else they take, and they will try to take a great deal. Second, trust Ethan Vale with your life, for he is the best man I have ever known, and he kept us alive when no one else on earth would have bothered to try. If he is with you now, thank him for me, for the fire and the years, and for being the father I should have had instead of the men I was given. And know that anything he tells you of me is true, and anything he tells you to do, you should do. Wren glanced at the old man asleep against the window, his white head jolting gently with the truck, and her throat closed, and she made herself read on. Third, and this is the practical part, so attend. The fortune is real, and it is yours, and it is hidden where Ethan will show you. And it is enough to make you free for your whole life and your children's lives if you are careful and wise. But it is dangerous, more dangerous than poverty, because the people it came from will kill to get it back, and will kill you simply for existing as proof of what they did to me. Do not try to claim it alone or quickly or in your own name without protection. You will be making yourself a target the size of the fortune itself. There is one man who can help you do it safely. His name is Daniel Reyes. When I knew him, he was a young lawyer, junior at a firm that did work for my family, and he was the only one of them with a conscience, and the family destroyed his career for refusing to help them railroad me into a hospital, and so he has every reason to hate them and no reason to love their money, and every reason to help their victim's child. He helped me hide everything, at great risk to himself, asking nothing. If he lives, find him. He is the bridge. He knows the trust, he knows the law, he knows what was done, and he is the one person who can bring the fortune into the light slowly enough and publicly enough that it cannot be stolen back, and you cannot be quietly killed. His details are in the envelope with this letter. Tell him the Wren has come home. He will know what it means. He is the only living soul besides and who knows you exist. Last, my songbird. I have to stop now because I can hear them, and I do not know how much time. So quickly, the most important thing, the thing I would say if I could say only one. Do not let what they did to me, and what they will try to do to you, turn you into one of them. The fortune is a tool, nothing more. It is a key, and a key is only as good as the door it opens, and the door I wanted to open for you is freedom, not a fortress. Be free, Wren. Be small and free and loud, like the bird I named you for. Help people with it. The people the world forgets, the people on cold stream banks deciding whether to keep arguing. Be the person who sits down beside them. That is what Ethan did for me, and it saved my life, and it is the only thing money is truly good for. Do that, and they will not have one, no matter what becomes of me. Do that, and I will have been a good mother after all, even from wherever I am. I love you past the end of the world. Be brave. I knew you would be. Your mother, Maren. Wren read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she folded it very carefully along its old creases and held it against her chest with both hands, and looked out through the windshield at the dark road unspooling in the headlights. And she did not cry, though her face was wet, because crying was a thing that came and went, and this was something else, something that arrived and stayed. She had been somebody's wanted child. She had been loved before she had a name. The blank where her mother should have been was not blank after all. It had been full all along, full of a woman fierce and clever and tender who had used the last hour of her life to be practical out of love, and Wren felt that woman settle into the empty place inside her where she had always carried the cold, and the cold did not vanish. But it had company now, and company was everything. She had spent 19 years believing, in the deepest unspoken part of herself, that she had not been kept because she was not worth keeping. The letter killed that belief stone dead. She had not been kept because keeping her would have gotten her killed. It was the opposite of what she'd feared her whole life. She had been let go out of love so absolute it could survive its own absence for 15 years and reach her in the dark of a stranger's truck and put its arms around her at last. "All right," Halloran said quietly, eyes on the road, not looking at her, giving her the privacy of his not looking. "Yeah," Wren said, and was surprised to find it nearly true. "Yeah, I'm all right." They drove through the night. Ethan woke twice, the second time in some pain, and Wren got the blanket around him and found that the careful old hands shook worse than they had the day before, and she did the arithmetic she did not want to do, the arithmetic of how little time, and she set her jaw and resolved that whatever else happened, she would not waste a day of what was left of him. The city rose up around them toward dawn, first as a glow and then as a scatter of lights, and then as the real thing. Towers and overpasses and the hard sodium orange of a place that never fully slept, and it frightened Wren more than the dark woods had, because the woods had only had one man on a ridge in them, and the city had millions of people in it, and any one of them might be the wrong one. Halloran knew where he was going. He'd had her read him the address from the envelope once, in the dark, and then he'd said, "Now I've forgotten it," the way he'd promised, and driven on by memory he claimed not to have, and as the sky grayed toward morning, he turned off a wide avenue into a quieter district of older buildings, brick and stone, lawyers' country, and he slowed and peered at numbers and stopped at last outside a narrow building with a brass plate beside the door too far to read. "This is it," he said, "or this is the address, anyway. Whether your man's still behind that door after 15 years is between you and your luck." He set the brake. "I'll wait. Don't argue. I'll wait an hour. And if you come out needing to go somewhere else, I'll take you. And if you come out and tell me to go, I'll go. And either way I was never here. But I'll wait the hour, because that old man can't run anymore, and somebody ought to be at the curb if running's needed." Wren looked at Ethan. He was awake now, gripping his stick, his face gray in the dawn, but his eyes clear and fixed on the narrow building. "Go," he said. "Take the box. Take the letter. I'll come behind you slow. Ring the bell, and when someone answers, you say the words your mother gave you. The Wren has come home, and you watch his face. And if his face does the right thing, you'll know. And if it does the wrong thing, you turn around, and you walk straight back to this truck, and we drive, and we think again. Trust your eyes. You've good eyes. You've her eyes." He reached over and squeezed her wrist. Once, with what strength he had. "Go on, songbird. This is the door. Everything your mother built comes down to whether the man behind it is still the man she trusted. Go and find out." Wren got out of the truck. The morning air was cold and smelled of the city, exhaust and wet stone and somewhere bread baking. She crossed the empty sidewalk to the narrow building and read the brass plate at last, and it said Reyes and Associates, attorneys at law, and under it, smaller, Daniel T. Reyes, and her heart lurched, because the name was right. The name her mother had written was right here on a brass plate 15 years later, which meant the man might be right too, might be behind this door, might be the bridge. She climbed the 3 stone steps with the music box in the crook of her arm and the letter against her heart, and she found the bell, and she pressed it, and somewhere inside the building it rang, and she stood on the step in the gray dawn at the end of everything she had been and the beginning of everything she might become, and she waited. And after a long moment that contained her whole future, she heard, from inside, the sound of a lock being turned. The door opened on a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, in shirt sleeves with no tie, holding a coffee mug, his face carrying the particular tiredness of a person who comes in to work before his own staff, because the work is the only thing that has ever made the days bearable. He looked at Wren, a thin girl in a worn jacket clutching a small wooden box on his step at dawn, and his expression moved through the ordinary sequence, mild surprise, the beginning of a question, the lawyer's reflexive courtesy. And Wren watched his face the way Ethan had told her to watch it, and she said the words. The Wren has come home. She would remember what his face did for the rest of her life. The coffee mug came down slowly to his side, as if his arm had forgotten it was holding anything. The tiredness fell away, and under it was something raw and disbelieving and terrified, and, beneath even that, beginning to break through like light under a door, something that was almost unbearable to look at because it was hope. Daniel Reyes stared at her, and his eyes moved over her face feature by feature the way Ethan's had in the chamber, and his voice, when it came, was barely a sound at all. "You have her eyes," he said. "My God, you have Maren's eyes." And then the lawyer who had not let himself believe for 15 years that this morning would ever come stepped back and pulled the door wide and said, "Come in. Come inside, quickly, off the step. Are you alone? Is anyone with you?" And when Wren said and was coming behind her slow, Reyes looked past her down the steps to where the old man was laboring up from Halloran's truck on his stick, and something crossed his face, recognition and grief together, and he said, "Ethan Vale. He's still alive. He kept his word. Of course he kept his word." And he went down the steps himself, this tired man in shirt sleeves, and took the old man's free arm, and helped Maren Ashford's two protectors meet again across 15 years, and the three of them went in together, and the door closed behind them. What followed, over the days and then the weeks that came after, was not the kind of thing that makes for a single dramatic scene, and Wren came to understand that this was precisely the point, that the slowness was the safety, that Daniel Reyes was building around her exactly the kind of fortress of law and witness and daylight that her mother's letter had insisted on. He moved her and into a quiet place he owned outside the city, a house with no name on it. And he sent Halloran home with the $40 Ethan owed him and a great deal more besides that Halloran tried to refuse and was made to take. And Halloran drove off back toward the hills with his memory letting go of addresses, and was never any trouble to anyone, and lived out his days never once telling the story, because some men are simply built solid all the way through. And then Reyes began, methodically, to do the thing he had spent his ruined career preparing for without knowing it. He told Wren the shape of it across a kitchen table over many evenings, the way Ethan had told her the past, except that Reyes was telling her the future, and the future had to be built rather than merely remembered. The fortune could not appear all at once. That would be a flare in the night sky, drawing exactly the eyes that must not be drawn. Instead, they would surface it the way a diver surfaces from a great depth, in stages, with pauses, so that nothing burst. First, her identity. Reyes had kept things across the years, quietly, at risk, the way Ethan had kept the box, a sealed file of his own. The original trust documents, the provisions Maren's grandfather had written, sworn statements he had taken from people now dead, his own contemporaneous notes from the months when the family had moved to have Maren committed and he had refused to help and been destroyed for it. And, most precious of all, a sample, kept all these years on the chance this day would come, that could be matched against the girl who claimed to be Maren's daughter. The science was simple now, Reyes said, simpler than it had been. When he started keeping the file, they would prove, beyond the power of any Ashford lawyer to dispute, that Wren was Maren's child. That was the foundation. Everything else stood on it. And once it's proven, Reyes said, once it's filed and sworn and on the public record that Maren Ashford had a daughter who survived her, the whole calculation changes. You stop being a ghost, they can disappear, and you become a person the law knows about, a person whose death would now be investigated, a person whose existence is a matter of court record. The thing that killed your mother was that she could vanish without consequence. We are going to make it so that you cannot. We are going to make you so visible, so documented, so wrapped in process, that an accident becomes the most dangerous thing in the world for them, not for you. The fortune is the prize, but your visibility is the armor, and we put the armor on first, before we so much as mention the prize. Wren listened, and learned, and asked hard questions, and Reyes came to look at her with a respect that deepened week by week, because the girl was quick, quicker than he dared hope, and the quickness was not the brittle cleverness of someone trying to seem smart, but the deep practical intelligence of someone who had survived by understanding exactly how systems worked and exactly where they failed people like her. She had spent 19 years inside the machinery of indifferent institutions. She knew from the inside how a person became invisible, which meant she understood better than any lawyer how a person became visible again. She began, without quite noticing it, to stop being only the subject of the plan and to become a partner in it. Ethan was there for the foundation. That was the mercy Wren held on to afterward, the thing she was grateful for to the end of her own days. He was there in the quiet house when the proof came back, the science confirming what every eye that had seen her face already knew, that she was Maren's daughter beyond dispute. And the old man wept openly at the kitchen table, not from sadness this time, but from a relief so total it had nowhere to go but out through his eyes, because the thing he had guarded for 11 years was now true on paper, was now real in the eyes of the world, could now no longer be erased no matter what became of him. She's safe now, he kept saying, gripping Reyes's hand, and then Wren's. She's real now. You can't unmake her now. It's done. It's finally done. He held on another 6 weeks after that. He saw the filing made. He sat in the quiet house in a chair by the window that looked out on bare winter trees, growing thinner and grayer and more peaceful, and Wren did not waste a single day of it, the way she'd resolved in the truck. She sat with him every evening when the work was done, and she made him the bittersweet tea the way he liked it, and she learned to be still in the long, quiet stretches when he hadn't the breath to talk, which she discovered was its own kind of company, maybe the deepest kind, the kind she'd never been given and had to learn from him in the giving of it. He taught her the whole of her mother's song and the words to it, line by line on the good days, and made her sing it back until she had it perfect, the lullaby about the small brown bird who was not afraid of the dark. And he told her every story he had of Maren, opening up the 11 years he'd kept folded inside him, and Wren came to understand that he was emptying himself on purpose, pouring the mother into the daughter while there was still time, the way a man pours water from a cracked vessel into a sound one before the cracked one fails. He told her the small ones, which were the ones that mattered, how Maren had been hopeless at splitting wood for a whole winter and had wept with fury at it, and then one spring morning had simply gotten the knack of it and split a whole cord without stopping and come in glowing like she'd conquered a country. How she'd read aloud by the fire every night, the two of them taking turns, working through every book on the shelves and then through them again. How she'd named the hens after dead poets and argued with them. How she'd been frightened of thunder her whole life and had hidden it from everyone but Ethan. And how on the night Wren was born there had been a great storm over the hills, and Maren had labored through it gripping the old man's hand and saying she wasn't scared. The baby was coming, and that was bigger than the thunder, and the baby had come with the dawn as the storm broke, small and loud and furious. And Maren had laughed through her exhaustion and said, "There she is, there's my songbird. Listen to her, she's louder than the thunder already." He told Wren that, and Wren wept, and Ethan held her hand and said, You were louder than the thunder. You still are. Don't ever let them quiet you." And by the end of the 6 weeks, Wren had a mother built up out of an old man's memory the way other children had one built up out of their own. A real woman with a temper and a laugh and a fear of thunder and a way of glowing when she'd done a hard thing well. And that woman lived in Wren from then on and never left her. And then on a gray morning in the first week of the new year, the morning that should have been near her own true birthday by Ethan's reckoning, the old man did not wake, and Wren sat with him a long time before she told anyone, holding his cold hand in the winter light. And she found she could not be only sad, because he had died exactly as he'd hoped to and not a day before, having seen the Wren come home and made safe, and a death like that, at the end of a life like his, was not a tragedy. It was a completion. She wound the music box for him there in the quiet room and let it play him out. 11 notes rising and turning and falling, her mother's song for the man who had kept her mother's daughter, and then she buried him, with Reyes's help, in a sunlit corner of the grounds, and she put a stone over him with his name and 2 dates and 4 words she chose herself. He was not afraid. Only then, with the foundation laid and at rest, did Reyes move to the second stage, and the second stage was the one that brought the Ashfords at last out of the dark, and it did not go the way Wren had braced herself for. And the difference was the whole education of her young life. She had imagined, in the cabin and the truck and the early weeks, a kind of war. She had imagined the family as a single dark shape, a coordinated malevolence, and she had imagined herself standing against it. And she had been afraid, and also, in some hard-hidden corner, hungry for it, hungry to make them pay for her mother, hungry to be the instrument of a long-deferred justice. Reyes saw the hunger in her, and he sat her down before they filed the claim to the trust, and he said the truest thing anyone said to her in that whole long season. Listen to me, because your mother's letter said the same thing in fewer words, and I watched the family teach me this lesson the hard way over 30 years. The thing you are angry at is not a person. It is not even the family, most of whom are ordinary, frightened, greedy people no worse than half the world. The thing you are angry at is what money does to people when there is enough of it, and it has been around long enough. It turns people into its servants. It made your great-grandfather's children into jailers, and it made a doctor into a liar, and it made a sheriff into a coward, and it very nearly made me into an accomplice. And the only reason it didn't is that I was junior enough and poor enough that I could still afford a conscience. The Ashfords did not kill your mother because they were monsters. They killed her because the money required it, and they had long ago stopped being able to tell the difference between what the money required and what they wanted. If you go to war with them out of hatred, you will win, because we have the law and the truth and the proof. But you will become what they are. You will spend the next 20 years and a great deal of the fortune feeding the same machine that ate your mother. Or, he leaned forward, or you can do the thing your mother actually asked you to do, which is harder and which they will never see coming and which will hurt them far worse than any war, because they cannot fight it and they cannot understand it. You can simply take what is yours, cleanly, by law, in daylight, and then use it to become the opposite of everything they are. That is the only victory that doesn't cost you your soul, and it is the only one she wanted for you. So that was the war Wren chose, which was not a war at all, and it unfolded with a slow, inexorable quiet that was more devastating than any battle. Reyes filed the claim. He filed it complete, airtight, decades in the building. The trust, the provisions, the proof of Maren's death and Wren's survival and Wren's parentage, all of it on the public record at once, in daylight, witnessed, beyond any power to make it vanish in the dark. And the genius of it, the thing that took the Ashfords' breath away when their lawyers brought it to them, was that there was nothing to fight. The trust was the trust. Their own grandfather had written it. The provisions had passed the fortune to Maren and Maren's letter, and the law passed it to Maren's daughter. And there was no tainted madness to point to anymore, because Daniel Reyes had spent 30 years documenting that the madness had been a lie the family manufactured, and to fight Wren's claim now would mean putting that lie on trial in open court, would mean a public reckoning with how Maren Ashford had really died and who had really benefited. And that was the one thing in the world the family could not afford, because the daylight that protected Wren was the same daylight that would destroy them. They had built their whole crime on darkness. The instant it was dragged into the light, it could only be surrendered. The men who had managed the trust, the cousins and the lawyers, and the gray, careful inheritors of a 2-century habit of getting their way, found themselves checkmated by a homeless girl and a ruined lawyer and a dead hermit. And the checkmate was total, and the most they could do was send, through their own attorneys, a quiet request to meet. Not to fight, to meet, to see, perhaps, whether the thing could be managed, contained, made quiet. And Reyes asked Wren whether she wished to take the meeting, and warned her that she did not have to, that the law would do its work whether she sat across a table from them or not. And Wren thought about it for 3 days, and then said yes. Those 3 days were among the hardest of the whole long season, harder in their way than the night in the chamber or the morning of Ethan's death, because they were the days she had to decide what kind of person she was going to be, and no one could decide it for her. She walked the bare winter grounds of the quiet house, and she argued with herself. The hungry part of her, the hard-hidden part that had been forged in 19 years of being handed around and let down, wanted the war after all. It wanted to walk into that room and burn it down, to put the doctor's lie and the sheriff's cowardice and the man on the ridge into open court, to make the Ashford name a public shame for 100 years, to take everything from them the way they had taken everything from Maren. The hunger was not wrong, exactly. It was just. They had earned every bit of ruin she could bring on them. But she heard her mother's letter under it, the steady, practical, loving voice. Do not let what they did to me turn you into one of them. And she heard Reyes. You will win, but you will become what they are, and she heard Fn, who had done the coward's arithmetic that turned out to be the loving one, who had chosen the long, quiet, hard thing over the loud, satisfying one, and had been right. And on the third day, she understood that the hunger was the last piece of the Ashford inheritance she was carrying, the family poison in her own blood, and that the only way to truly refuse them was to refuse the hunger too. So she said yes to the meeting and no to the war, and the no was the bravest thing she ever did. Not for them, for her mother. Because Maren had run out a side door in the dark with nothing, alone, unwitnessed, erased, and her daughter was going to walk into a bright room and sit down across from the people who had done that to her, fully herself, fully named, fully protected, with her mother's song in her bag and her mother's eyes in her head, and let them look at the proof that they had failed, that the Wren had come home, that you cannot, in the end, erase a person who is loved enough to be reached across the years and the dark. The meeting was in a glass tower, in a room with a long table that reminded Wren of nothing so much as the long table in the cabin, and that thought steadied her when she walked in, because it reminded her where she came from and what she'd survived. There were 4 of them, 3 men and a woman, all of them old or aging, all of them in the kind of clothes that do not announce their cost, and they had the smooth, unreadable faces of people who had been managing rooms their whole lives, and Wren watched their faces the way Ethan had taught her, and she saw, under the smoothness, the thing she had not expected, and that undid all her remaining hatred in a single stroke. She saw that they were afraid of her, not of her lawyers or her claim, of her, of the thin girl with Maren's eyes who had walked out of a closed case 15 years dead, who was living proof that the worst thing they had ever done had not stayed buried, who could, if she chose, with the daylight she now stood in, and every one of them. They looked at her face, and they saw Maren looking back, and they were old enough to remember Maren, and Wren understood that whatever the law decided, these people would carry her face into their own dying the way and had carried Maren's, except that for them it would not be a comfort. It would be the thing that waited for them in the dark. She did not make a speech. She had prepared one, in her head, full of the things she'd wanted to say for a season, but sitting across from their fear, she found she didn't need it, and that the not needing it was its own kind of power, the kind her mother had meant. She said only a few things. She said that she knew what they had done, all of it, the doctor and the committal and the man on the ridge and the sheriff's phone call and the 15 years of her erased childhood, and that it was all documented and all safe and all beyond their reach to alter. She said that the law was going to give her what was hers, and there was nothing they could do about it, and they knew it. And then she said the thing that she had decided, in the 3 days of thinking, was the only thing worth saying to them, the thing that was both her mother's victory and her own. "I'm not going to pursue you," she said. "Not in court, not in the papers, not anywhere. Not because you don't deserve it. Because my mother asked me not to become you. And pursuing you is how I'd become you. I'd spend my life and her money feeding the same thing that ate her, and I won't. So you get to keep your freedom and your reputations and your comfortable old age. And that's not mercy. I want you to understand that. It's not forgiveness. You haven't earned forgiveness and you're not going to get it. It's just that I have better things to do with what she left me than to spend it on you." She stood up. "You're going to live a long time, probably, all of you. And every time you close your eyes, you're going to see that you lost anyway. You did the worst thing a person can do, and you got away with it in every way except the only one that matters, which is that you didn't get the money and you didn't erase the child, and you have to live the rest of your lives knowing a homeless girl beat you with nothing but the truth and a music box, and chose to walk away because you weren't worth her time. That's what I came here to give you. Not a fight. The knowledge that you weren't worth one." And she picked up her bag with her mother's song in it, and she walked out of the glass room, and she did not look back, and behind her she left 4 old people with smooth faces and frightened eyes who had won everything their whole lives and had finally, completely, lost. The fortune came to her in daylight, in stages, exactly as Reyes had planned, and there were no accidents, because she was too visible now to have one, and within a year it was done, all of it, the buried chamber emptied at last by armored trucks and careful experts under Reyes's eye. Wren went back for the emptying. She had to. She stood in the cold hollow on a bright spring morning while the experts carried it up out of the hill into the light. Crate by canvas-wrapped crate, the gold and the coins and the art and the long flat cases of documents. All of it that her mother had carried down those stairs in the dark over months of patient, hunted nights, now coming back up into the sun where Maren had always meant it to go. The woman in the heavy gilt frame came out into the daylight and turned out to be worth a fortune by herself, and the velvet trays of coins glittered when the sun touched them, and Wren watched it all and felt her mother in every piece of it. The love and the terror and the cleverness folded into each object. For $100 million that was really just a mother's whole heart converted into things that would not perish, waiting in the ground for the day the world was safe enough to give it back to her child. By the time the experts had it all reckoned and verified, it came to a sum even larger than the lawyer Maren had trusted had first guessed, near $400 million. Hers, free and clear, in the light, beyond anyone's power to take. The chamber stood empty when they were done, just bare stone and the single wooden chair where Ethan had kept his vigil, and Wren went down alone and sat in the chair a while in the dark, and then she came up and never went down again, and left the chair where it stood. The cabin Wren did not sell and did not empty of its other contents, the books and the photographs and the long table and the hearth where her mother had dried her cold feet and held her newborn child. She kept it. She had Reyes arrange for the hollow and the hills around it to be bought up and protected, the whole watershed of it, so that no one would ever build anything there, so that the cabin where she was born would stand untouched as long as the law could make it stand. And she went back, sometimes, alone, and sat in the room, and wound the box, and let the song fill the place it had been written for. And it was the only thing she ever did with the money that was purely for herself. The first time she went back alone, after all of it was finished, after the Ashfords and the daylight and the emptying of the chamber, she did not bring anyone. She drove up the cracked road and parked where the bus had once let her off, at the edge where the asphalt gave way to gravel, and she walked into the trees the way she had the first time, except that this time she knew the way. The forest had not changed. The broken stone wall still ran off through the woods, and the hollow still dropped away cold and green, and the stream still ran black between its stones, and the cabin still stood with its milky window like a blind eye that had, she understood now, never been blind at all, but only patient, only waiting. She had the steps rebuilt by then, and the porch made sound, but inside she had changed nothing. The books were on the shelves. The photographs were on the mantel, clean now so she could see the faces, and one of them, she had found, was Maren, young and laughing in a doorway with the light behind her, the only photograph of her mother in all the world, and Wren had it copied 100 times and kept the original here where it belonged. The long table stood where it had always stood. The hearth was cold but ready, and Wren sat at the table in the quiet and wound the brass key and let the 11 notes rise. And she was 4 years old and 19 years old and 40 years old all at once. All the ages she had been and would be folded into the one girl listening to her mother's song in the room where her mother had sung it. And she understood that she would come back here her whole life, that this was the one place on earth that was simply, completely, unconditionally hers, the way nothing had ever been hers before, and that her mother had given it to her along with everything else, this room, this song, this hollow, this single still point that the world could not take. Everything else she did the way her mother had asked. It took her years to learn how, and Reyes helped her, and so did the people she gathered around her, the ones she chose by watching their faces, but the shape of it was clear to her from the start, because her mother had drawn it in the last hour of her life. Be the person who sits down beside them. The people on cold stream banks deciding whether to keep arguing. Wren knew exactly who those people were because she had been one of them. On the gravel at the edge of the county road with $72 and a duffel bag and nowhere in the world to be. On the morning of the day, she'd followed a song into the woods. She knew the precise weight of being a child the world had agreed to forget, a ghost in a system that swallowed children and lost them on purpose or by indifference. And she knew that the difference between the life that had been planned for her and the life she got was nothing more or less than being loved enough that someone reached across 15 years in the dark to find her. Most of them never got reached. That was the thing she could not stop seeing once she'd seen it. Most of the forgotten children stayed forgotten, aged out of the system the way she had, with a folder and a voucher and a handshake, and walked off into a world that had no place for them. And the only thing standing between them and the cold stream bank was luck, and luck was not enough, and luck was not just. So she became the person who reached. She built it slowly and carefully, the way Reyes had taught her to do everything. And she did not put her own name on it grandly or seek the cameras, because that was the Ashford instinct, and she had cut it out of herself. She built it quiet and real and lasting, an endowment large enough to outlive her by a century, aimed with a precision that only someone who'd been through it could manage, at the exact places where children fell through and were lost. She made mistakes at first, expensive ones, and she let herself make them because Reyes told her that the only people who never made mistakes with money were the ones who never did anything real with it. She learned that good intentions and a large check could do harm as easily as good, that there were whole industries built on the appearance of helping forgotten children that did not help them at all, that fed instead on the helping the way the Ashford money had fed on Maren. She learned to find the rare ones who did the work right, the small, underfunded people sitting beside stream banks all over the country with no resources and no rest. And she learned that her real job was not to be the hero, but to find those people and pour everything they needed into them, and then get out of their way. She learned to ask the children themselves what they needed instead of deciding for them, because she remembered with perfect clarity how it had felt to be decided for, how every safe choice other people made on her behalf had landed her on that gravel road with nothing. She built the thing around their voices instead of her own. And the heart of it, the part she ran herself and never delegated to anyone, was the simplest and the hardest. She found the ones aging out, the 18-year-olds standing in offices taking their folders and their vouchers and their handshakes, the ones at the exact hinge she had stood at, and she made sure that not one of them walked out a gate into nothing the way she had. Each one got what she had gotten by sheer accident. A person who knew their name, a foundation under their feet, the means to be free and to choose, and someone on the other end of a phone who would not let go no matter what, for as long as it took, for years if it took years. Not charity that made the givers feel good and changed nothing. The other kind. The kind that found the ghosts and made them real. She funded it forever, and she worked at it herself, every day, for the rest of her life. And she sat down beside more cold stream banks than she could count. And some of the people on them lived because she did, the way she had lived because Ethan had. And that, she came to understand, was the only true fortune, the only one that compounded, the only one death could not reach. Daniel Reyes she kept close to the end of his days, which came a good while later, the conscience of a wrecked career finally vindicated. A man who had lost everything for refusing to help do an evil thing, and had lived long enough to help undo it, and who said to Wren once, near his own end, that the girl who'd appeared on his step at dawn had given him back 30 years of his life by making them mean something. And Wren held his hand the way she'd held Anne's and told him it was true, that everything good in her own life ran back through him, and let him go in peace. And she found, as the years went on and the people who had known her mother fell away one by one, that she was the last keeper of Maren, the only living soul who carried her, and she did not let her drop. She told Maren's story to the children she helped, the true one, the running and the cabin and the song and the fortune built into the earth out of love, and she taught some of them the song itself, the lullaby about the small brown bird who was not afraid of the dark because the dark was where the stars lived, and the song went out into the world that way, into the mouths of forgotten children who were forgotten no longer, and Maren Ashford, who had died alone and erased at the foot of a cellar stair, became in the end the most remembered woman Wren ever knew, sung by hundreds, then thousands, of the kind of children she had wanted her daughter to help. And that was a victory the Ashfords and their glass towers could never have imagined and never could have stopped, and it was the only one that had ever mattered. Wren kept the music box on a shelf where the morning light reached it, and she wound it most days, all her long life, and she never once heard the 11 notes rise and turn and fall without being, for the length of the song, the girl on the gravel road again, hearing it for the first time on the wind, not knowing yet that it was her mother's voice reaching across everything to say, "Be brave. I knew you would be. Come home." She had been small, and she had been free, and she had been loud. Exactly as she was named to be. Exactly as she was wanted to be. And when she was very old, and it was her own turn to let go, she asked that the box be wound for her at the end the way she'd wound it for Ethan, and someone did. One of the children she had reached who was a child no longer, and the song played her out, rising and turning and falling. And the last thing Wren Ashford heard in this world was her mother singing to her. Across the whole length of a life that had begun in a cabin in the woods and had been, against everything, against all the odds the world had set against a forgotten girl, a good one, a free one, a loved one all the way through, from the first note to the last. The cabin still stands in the protected hollow, and the hills around it belong to no one and to everyone. And on still autumn evenings, people who walk the old logging cut sometimes say they hear, very faint, drifting up out of the trees, 3 notes, then a fourth, a small bright phrase that turns over twice and goes on, the beginning of a song that has no end, waiting, the way it always waited, for the right ears to come home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.